Hello, mine fellow craft goblins, and welcome back to mildly historical blundering time. Today it's tea gown time, or inspired by late Victorian tea gown time, as I didn't stay 100% close to the history here for mostly practical reasons and also show-off reasons. Tea gowns, if you're not familiar with the history of them, were very informal clothes, typically worn only around the house and when hosting small groups of intimate friends. It wasn't something you would wear out of the house, so they're like your sweatpants of the Victorian era. Fancy, frilly sweatpants. This, however, is obviously not made from sweatpants material. It's made out of a layer of wool garbadine suiting in the shade Muted Midnight Blue from Fabric Mart and some quilting cotton in a galaxy print from Joann's. But I also used a little bit of 100% linen apparel something, as well as some cotton drill for tailoring purposes. I looked up a lot of historical tea gowns in order to make this project, and I found quite a few in that sort of open front with an insert style that was very popular in the 1890s, and didn't realize that all three that I was referencing most when I was patterning this, they were all made for the same person. They were all made for Dowager Empress Maria, the Dagmar of Denmark. Two of these gowns seem to have at one point been in the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in Russia, but I can't find any listing of them on their website. I could only find these two unsourced Pinterest posts, and the third is hosted by the Met and is explicitly not for public use, so I was unable to use that image in this, but it is a Worth gown and it's gorgeous. In the end, the pattern for this tea gown looks very similar to other tea gowns that I've seen. At least the patterns for the general shapes are pretty close, although they're not exact, and I know exactly where I goofed up on from actually making this up, just from the way that it lays as opposed to the way that it should lay. But there's nothing I can do about it now without recutting the entire garment, so it's just gonna live like that. It has a front and a side back panel that are from the shoulder to the floor, or from the armpit to the floor in the case of the side back panel. However, the center back panel is actually split up into two because I wanted to have a little bit of gathering at the waist in the back so that I could get more of a floofing effect at the back with some cartridge pleats, but that didn't quite work, and I will most definitely be using another method because the wool that I used isn't thick enough to support those cartridge pleats, so it just sort of goes flat. I know I put those cartridge pleats in the back. These gowns are actually pretty famous for having Watteau pleats at the center back, so a big chunk of fabric pleated up, and it's supposed to look really cool and elegant. However, I just don't like the way they look, and based on what's available in terms of evidence, there probably were just as many plain back tea gowns as Watteau pleated back tea gowns, so it's not an unheard of thing. They're just sort of... the Watteau pleats are iconic is the only way I can explain it. I also wanted this to be a pretty functional garment, so I put in pockets, because you don't make a functional garment without pockets. I also had to piece together some of the lining. I thought I drafted it so that I wouldn't have to piece together anything, but I had to piece together stuff anyway. Somehow I just managed to peek the corners off the edge of those flared panels. I was really excited about this project, so I decided to take the 9 million years it took to pad stitch linen, not canvas, but some lightweight apparel linen into the front panel and along the hemline of this tea gown in order to provide it some heft and some body and some stiffness that makes it drape really well along the front bust in the hemline, but it did take a million years. What can I say? I was excited. I watched other people make their tea gowns, and I saw Prior Attire's tea gown, and I was like, oh, those look so nice. So I suffered and did 9,000 hours of this pad stitching in order to get this nice effect. Can't say I regret it, although I do regret putting it so close to the edge of my panels, because then it ended up in the seam and that was just a mess. As was typical of Victorian dresses and mostly bodices, I flatlined my entire tea gown, meaning that I put the lining layer and the top layer, my fashion fabric, together and pinned it and used that as one piece for the rest of the assembly process. Normally in the Victorian era, these edges would be either pinked in the case of edges that didn't fray easily, or just whip stitched down, depending on how often you plan to use the garment. However, I wasn't even sure that that was gonna contain this suiting. Don't get me wrong, it's very nice suiting. It drapes beautifully. It frays like you wouldn't believe. I had to zigzag it just to wash it before I made it up into this tea gown, because it frayed that much, even when it was just a swatch that I was making sure it wouldn't dissolve or anything in the sink. I'm taking advantage of the only gap in my audio in order to add that I went for an ankle-length hem, because traditionally these tea gowns had very long hems and very long trains because you didn't have to wear it outside, so you didn't have to worry about it getting dirty. However, I have a rug full of glitter and pins, so that seemed like an impractical idea for me. With the wool zigzagged into submission, I was able to start on my cartridge pleats. I finished these with a little bit of a ribbon and steamed it into place, but honestly, these cartridges do not look great. The wool that I chose does not have the texture in order to support cartridge pleats unless they're really, 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 really super dense. So really, I should have just gathered this edge and gotten a lot nicer of a visual effect that way, but it's too late now, so I'm just gonna live with it. I probably could have gone through and gotten rid of the ribbon and just nicely finished this off with some gathering, but at that point I had whip stitched it on when I realized that it was full of ugly gaps. So at that point I was like, what did I spend all this work for? So I just ended up keeping the ugly cartridge pleats, and to deal with the gaps situation, the gaps between the cartridge pleats, I just whip stitched the seam allowance down to the seam allowance on the cartridge pleats, and like, it doesn't look great, but the earth still turns. The sleeves that I saw on tea gowns existent from the period generally weren't huge. They definitely weren't tight sleeves, but they weren't like the giant balloon sleeves of the 1890s that we so commonly think of. So I generally went, when I was drafting my two-part sleeves for the first time, I was going for sort of a, not exactly a baggy sleeve, but a loosely fitted sleeve. And I thought this process was going to be a disaster, so I didn't film it because I'd never drafted a two-part sleeve before. But it actually wasn't that bad, and it only took me 2 mock-ups. So, sorry I don't have any footage of that. But I did end up, in the end, making it a little tighter than I had intended anyway, just because I'm phobic of anything not being super fitted. Then it was time to get my main body of the tea gown together, if you can call it that. I sewed the back and the side back together first, which is not something that I recommend, because when you sew the back and the side back and the front pieces together, you have to add the pockets, and it's a lot easier to add the pockets before the garment is all one piece. But if you sew the side back to the back first, you end up with a really heavy garment that's really hard to put pockets in. And I wish I had thought of that when I was doing it, but I only thought of it just now. I used my usual selvage edge and French seam technique that you've seen me do in other videos, so I'm not going to go too much into the process here, and managed to put my pockets in too low again. I don't know why I keep doing that, but apparently this is just a lesson that I forget in between every garment. Every garment I put the pockets in too low and then remember, oh, I put my pockets in too low. I also did my dart up around the same time I was doing my cartridge pleats, thinking to get everything squared away before I started sewing stuff together, and I think I just blew right past it while I was complaining about my cartridge pleats, but please know that around the cartridge pleating time was the time that I ended up putting my dart in, and I just sort of felt around until I identified the edges of the linen in order to identify where my dart needed to be. If you are the kind of person who is afeared of sleeves, this project with the two-part Victorian sleeves isn't actually that bad. Because everything is flatlined, it's really obvious where the right and wrong side is to put them together. You just sort of insert the sleeve and use that as a marker. And because they've got the elbow joint, there's a clear front and back to the sleeve rather than just the difference being in the arm thigh. It makes it really easy to identify in what direction your sleeves need to be set. I then inserted a waist tape into the tea gown. If you don't know what a waist tape is, it's just a bit of just regular cotton tape. I used some twill tape that I had in my stash in order to reinforce the waistline, and I just secured it with some running stitches in only the seam allowance on the inside. This helps reinforce the narrowest part of the waist, ensuring that it doesn't stretch out, and also provided it a little bit more structure, so I maintained a fitted back on the back of my tea gown, which was used a lot, especially in older things. There was a trend at one point for a really fitted back and a voluminous front in bodices, and I was sort of stealing from that, even if my front was going to be very loose. While I was at it with the handwork, I went through and I secured. There was no waist tape and no waistband to suspend the pocket from, if you're familiar with pocket techniques, and let's be real, who isn't? They were typically to kind of balance out the weight of the pocket and keep it from just hanging from the side seams. It's secured to the waistband with a little bit of tape. But my front panel was open, so there was no waist tape to secure it to, so I went through and stitched it to the dart, which, I mean, it does kind of spread out the weight of the pocket. Earth still turns. Then I put together my contrasting lapels. These are a bit of folded over cotton, which are reinforced with a little bit of drill. Someone with like forethought probably would have like looked up a YouTube tutorial for how to make a straight lapel like that, but I'm not one of those people, so I just cut out straight strips. I was also worried about running out of fabric at this point. Then I just pinned it so that the raw edges would be trapped on the outside and hidden by the lapels, and just top stitched it down and dealt with whatever weird funky folding that it wanted to do at the neckline later, so that I wouldn't have to think about drafting this. Except for the reinforcement, this is absolutely not how you're supposed to do this, but that did not stop me from doing it anyway, and I paid the price later because I put it on and then it folded up weirdly at the neck, and in order to deal with this problem, I just pinned the neck, like the behind the neck bit, down where it wanted to be and just top stitched across. Again, this is absolutely not how you're supposed to do this, but it's how I ended up doing it. I'm not sure how they got, because in the gowns that I was looking at, one of them clearly has something that would be straight grain, and I'm like, how did you do that? I also used the same technique on the armhole cuffs, and that worked out a lot better because it was obviously just straight lines to straight lines, and I wasn't trying to force a straight line to go around a curve, which I knew wasn't gonna work, but I was like, but she did it! Then it was hem time, and I faced this hem, meaning I just copied the bottom 6 inches from my pattern onto some new pieces and used that. The bottom edge of this was at a curve, so there wasn't any real chance of me being able to make straight things fit on that curve. It just would have puckered and been weird. So I put the facing on the inside and then turned it toward the outside, and then what was now the top edge just turned that inward and top stitched it down. I wasn't concerned about top stitching with this project because with this one I was like, done is better than good. And just because of the nature of facing a hem, you tend to go through a lot of fabric, which is why I was concerned about running out if I recut the lapel pieces to even be on the bias instead of the straight grain. So that's why I was so nervous about that. Normally tea gowns also, in addition to the sort of robe layer, had a front panel of just sort of gathered cotton with a collar in order to make it not be a tits out kind of look. However, I didn't want to add that layer because I wanted to be able to show off the Edwardian slips that I've been working so hard on that I still have not finished. So I decided to leave that out, and I would experiment with getting that look without the front panel later. So I made like a half a belt to go in the front, and then I ended up doing like a lot of hooks and eyes. I sewed in that half a belt thing with really tiny little whip stitches in hopes that it would be secure enough, just whip stitch to the lining, because I didn't want any more top stitching just there where that was. And then I used some hook and eye tape and whip stitched that so that it would secure at one side. I think it's the left side. And then I realized that that was still hanging kind of too loose, and then remembered, oh, it's because it would be secured to the front of that cotton panel. So I ended up using 4 more hooks and eyes, which I installed the wrong way 4 times before I was finally able to get them in a non-stupid spot in order to secure the lapels of the robe to that belt thing, and I actually really like the effect that it has. I swear, you guys, I managed to sew on the hooks on, like, the body side, so if you put the eyes in there, they were just gonna fall off, and then I managed to sew the eyes, like, on the inside of the sash instead of the outside of the sash. It was a disaster. Despite the fact that you have heard me complain this whole video about what a struggle it was for me to finish this garment, I'm really, really proud of this, and it's one of my favorite pieces that I've made in quite a while. It drapes beautifully and it spins beautifully. Like, I can't stop spinning around when I wear it. It's a bit of a trial to get into, but once it's on, it's really comfortable. And so I think I'm gonna get a lot of wear out of this, and I might make some of those little sweat guard things so that I don't have to wash it quite as often. I want to reduce the amount of washing that I really need to do just because this is a wool garment. I'm not concerned about completely destroying it, but I know that those edges they're gonna fray eventually. If you would like to hear me complain on a slightly more regular basis, you can follow me on the social medias. They will be linked in the description box below, as well as my Discord, which I complain on frequently. Actually, it's not just a scout complaining board. It's actually a pretty cool spot to hang out. And it's not just for sewists, it's also for sculptors, 3D modelers, painters, digital artists, writers, all sorts of people are free to join the Discord board, and there will be a community there to say, hell yeah, you're doing great. And in particular, we pride ourselves on being a safe sort of space for queer and gender nonconforming people who are into historical costuming, because that seems like sort of a niche group that can be unwelcome in other areas of historical stuff, so I didn't see that existed, so I figured I would make one. Or if you don't want to join the Discord board, you can just complain to me down below about whatever struggles you're facing with your tea gown. Hopefully it's going better than mine did. In any case, thank you for watching. Maybe hit the like button, drive my engagement up so that the YouTube algorithm favors me, and hopefully I will see you guys a little bit sooner next time. Good God, there were some bikers who tried to start a conversation with me when I was walking up the hill in the park, and I hope to God they think I was doing nature photography, because I had like 2 tripods and this fancy ass camera, and I am too nervous to ever tell anyone, oh hey, yeah, I'm a YouTuber. Subscribe to Spooky Scary Scouticus.